The runway lights snap on at midnight, July 26th, 1942, illuminating city Haneish airfield in Egypt, a German stronghold 235 miles behind enemy lines. A Junker U-52 transport plane touches down, its belly packed with ammunition for Rommel's Afrika Korps. The German pilot cuts his engines, completely unaware that 18 British jeeps are roaring toward him through the enveloping darkness. Captain David Stirling grips his steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. Behind him, 17 more jeeps fan out in a V formation, each mounted with 4 Vickers K machine guns. The men inside wear sand-covered uniforms, some with German tunics pulled over their British battle dress. Their pockets are stuffed with bombs invented by a dead comrade. Stirling raises his flare pistol and fires. A green light arcs across the desert sky. "Now!" he screams. The jeeps explode onto the runway at 40 miles per hour, their tracer rounds slicing through the darkness like red lightning. This was not conventional warfare. It was something new, something desperate, and technically a war crime. This audacious raid was the culmination of an idea born from catastrophic failure. Just months earlier, in November 1941, the newly formed L Detachment of the Special Air Service had launched its first mission, Operation Squatter. The plan was for 55 paratroopers to jump into the Libyan desert and attack 5 German airfields on foot. It was a disaster. A violent desert storm, the kind seen only once a decade, scattered the men across 70 miles of treacherous wasteland. Equipment was lost, and men were dragged to their deaths by uncontrollable parachutes. Only 21 men made it back to base. 34 were lost, and not a single enemy aircraft was destroyed. In Cairo, headquarters dubbed it Stirling's Folly, the vanity project of a Scottish aristocrat with 0 military experience. They debated shutting his unit down entirely. The war situation was desperate. Rommel was winning, and his supply lines, heavily reliant on air transport, were proving resilient against both the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. Conventional bomber raids on airfields were suicide missions, resulting in devastating losses for the Allies for minimal gain. David Stirling, however, saw a flaw in the enemy's defenses that everyone else had missed. His moment of insight was revolutionary in its simplicity. Airfields were vast, perimeters were thin, and security inside the wire was lax. Mechanics, ground crews, and pilots moved about with casual familiarity. No one expected the enemy to simply walk through the front gate. Stirling realized they shouldn't parachute in or fight their way through. They should just walk in, wearing the right uniforms, speaking the right words, acting like they belonged. Then they would burn everything. It was theater, it was deception, and it was a clear violation of the Hague Convention of 1907, which prohibited the use of enemy uniforms in combat. The penalty for such an act was summary execution. Yet, as Stirling argued to his skeptical superiors, Hitler was already executing commandos wherever they were found. The old rules were crumbling in the face of a new kind of war. He needed men who understood this, men who would do what was necessary, not what was proper. He found one such man in Lieutenant Robert Blair Paddy Mayne, a brooding Irish rugby star and solicitor who was more often in the brig for striking superior officers than he was on the battlefield. Stirling saw past the rage and the drinking to a core of relentless, focused violence. Mayne didn't care for rules. He cared about results. In a test raid in December, Mayne led a small team onto Wadi Tamat airfield. They placed their homemade bombs on 24 aircraft and watched them erupt. But on the final plane, Mayne ran out of explosives. He didn't retreat. Instead, he climbed into the cockpit and, with his bare hands, tore the entire instrument panel out, rendering the bomber useless. When Stirling heard the story, he knew Mayne was the weapon he needed. Meanwhile, another crucial element was being forged. Lieutenant Jock Lewis, another original member, retreated to a makeshift desert workshop. He began experimenting with plastic explosive, thermite, and diesel oil, meticulously hand-mixing compounds. The result was the Lewis bomb, a 1-pound device that could blast through aluminum and ignite aircraft fuel with terrifying efficiency. It was simple, portable, and deadly. One man could now carry the means to destroy a dozen aircraft. The method and the means were now in place. All they needed was permission to break the rules. The plan was audacious, but it required official sanction. In a meeting room in Cairo, David Stirling faced his superiors. Lieutenant Colonel Devoir argued vehemently against the proposal, his face flushed with anger. You are asking permission to commit a war crime, Stirling. The Hague Convention is explicit. If your men are caught, they will be shot as spies. There will be no trial, no prisoner exchange. The room was tense, other officers shifting uncomfortably. Stirling remained steadfast. He presented the numbers, the undeniable math of destruction. With 5 men and homemade bombs, they had destroyed 24 aircraft. Imagine what 50 men could do. The debate raged until Brigadier Dudley Clark entered, holding a folder marked Most Secret. He cut through the moralizing with cold, hard reality. We are 3 months from losing Egypt, he stated. The question is not whether we follow rules written in 1907, but whether we win a war in 1942. General Neil Ritchie, commander of the 8th Army, made the final call. Authorized, he said to Stirling. But absolute deniability. If your men are captured, you were acting without orders, make it count. The first critical test of the new tactic came not with a bang, but with a bluff. A captured German truck, driven by SIG operatives in perfect Afrika Korps uniforms, approached a checkpoint outside Benghazi. Inside, hidden under tarpaulins, Stirling and his men held their breath. Lieutenant Halavi of the SIG, a Jewish refugee from Palestine, leaned out the window. Guten Abend, he said, his accent flawless. Fuel delivery. The German sentry, bored and unsuspecting, waved them through without a second glance. They had driven straight through the front gate. The proof of concept was complete. Back at headquarters, the success was met with uneasy silence. It worked, but it was illegal. Yet, the strategic imperative was overwhelming. The stage was set for the largest coordinated airfield raid in history, scheduled for June 9th, 1942. 4 SAS teams and 1 SIG unit would hit 5 airfields simultaneously across Libya. On the night of June 9th, the plan swung into action. At Burqa Airfield, Lieutenant Stephen Hastings crouched behind a sand dune, watching German sentries patrol the perimeter. With him were 2 SIG operatives, their enemy uniforms a perfect disguise. They stood, walked calmly to the checkpoint, and bluffed their way inside. Hastings and his 12 SAS men slipped through the darkness behind them. Inside the wire, they became shadows between rows of parked Junkers and Messerschmitts. Each man carried 12 Lewis bombs. Hastings placed his first charge on an engine cowling, struck the time pencil, and moved to the next aircraft. 30 seconds. He was on his third when the first bomb detonated. A pillar of flame erupted 200 feet into the sky, followed by the shriek of sirens and confused shouts in German. The raiders moved faster, planting their remaining bombs as chaos erupted around them. Hastings planted his 12th and final bomb and sprinted for the fence. Behind him, a symphony of destruction played out. 12 explosions, 12 fireballs, 12 aircraft turned to molten scrap. They regrouped in the desert, 1 man lightly wounded, but all alive. The radio crackled. Burqa raid successful. 12 aircraft confirmed, destroyed. That same night, at Benina Airfield, Paddy Mayne was writing his own chapter of the legend. His team didn't rely on subtlety once inside. Mayne moved with a terrifying methodical fury, placing Lewis bombs with cold efficiency. When his supply ran out, he did not stop. He climbed into a German bomber's cockpit and, as he had done before, tore the instrument panel out with his bare hands, wires snapping and metal shrieking in protest. "Sir, we need to leave," his sergeant urged, horrified. "1 more," Mayne growled, already moving to the next aircraft. By the time German troops began organizing a response, Mayne had personally sabotaged 14 aircraft, 8 with bombs, 6 with his hands. His team escaped without a single casualty. The raids continued over the next 4 nights, a whirlwind of fire and audacity across 5 airfields. The final tally was staggering. 61 enemy aircraft destroyed. The cost was 3 SAS men killed and 2 SIG operatives captured. The 2 captured men, still wearing German uniforms, were executed by firing squad the next morning. There was no trial. The grim reality of their chosen warfare was now seared into the unit's soul. In Cairo, General Ritchie reviewed the reports. The math was undeniable. The SAS had achieved what entire bomber squadrons could not for a fraction of the cost. The experiment was no longer a folly. It was a revolution. The success of the June raids silenced the doubters in Cairo. But for David Stirling, it was only the beginning. The tactic had been proven, but its scale could be amplified. The Jeep, he realized, was the key to greater destruction. He envisioned not small teams on foot, but mobile columns of armed vehicles that could strike deep into enemy territory, unleashing overwhelming firepower in a matter of minutes. He assembled a fleet of 18 Jeeps, each a rolling fortress equipped with 4 mounted Vickers K machine guns. They would trade stealth for shock, secrecy for spectacle. The target was Sidi Haneish, a major Luftwaffe base swarming with aircraft. The plan was breathtakingly simple: a frontal assault at high speed. There would be no German uniforms this time. The SIG had been disbanded after too many of their men were captured and executed. This was to be a pure, violent demonstration of the SAS's newfound power. On the evening of July 25th, the convoy of jeeps, carrying 60 British and French commandos, lurched into the deep desert. They drove for hours under the oppressive sun, navigating by compass and the stars, a tiny armada on an ocean of sand. They hid through the daylight hours at a remote spot called Bir Kusei, their vehicles shrouded in camouflage nets, the men sweating and silent in the blistering heat. As darkness fell on July 26th, they moved again, the rumble of their engines a low growl in the vast, silent landscape. Finally, just before midnight, the runway lights of Sidi Haneish appeared in the distance, a constellation of man-made stars on the black horizon. As they watched, a Junker Ju-52 transport plane descended and landed, its engines winding down. It was the perfect signal. The airfield was active and unsuspecting. Stirling raised his flare pistol. The green flare arced across the sky, a silent, emerald command. "Now!" he screamed into the roaring wind. 18 jeeps erupted from the darkness and onto the flat, hard surface of the runway, accelerating to 40 miles per hour in a vast, sweeping V formation. For a moment, there was only the roar of engines and the sight of the parked aircraft silhouetted against the lights. Then, all 72 machine guns opened up at once. Tracer rounds, brilliant red streaks of death, crisscrossed the airfield, slicing through the darkness like red lightning. The first parked Stuka disintegrated under the concentrated fire, then a Heinkel, then a Messerschmitt. German ground crews, who had been attending to the newly landed transport, scattered in panic, their screams lost in the cacophony of gunfire and exploding fuel tanks. Anti-aircraft guns began to swivel, their crews frantically trying to draw a bead on the fast-moving, weaving targets that were already deep inside their perimeter. Paddy Main's jeep skidded to a halt beside a Junkers bomber. He leaped out, a Lewis bomb already in his hand, and planted it firmly in the engine cowling. He was back in the moving jeep before the thermite ignited, the blinding white-hot flash triggering a secondary explosion that sent a mushroom cloud of fire 200 feet into the air. The raid was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. German pilots, roused from their tents, stared in disbelief at the inferno. But the violence was not one-sided. Machine gun rounds from the defending troops began to find their marks. Lance Bombardier John Robson, a 21-year-old manning a rear gun, took a bullet through the chest and died instantly. His was the only life lost. For 15 minutes, the SAS jeeps raced up and down the rows of aircraft, guns blazing, planting bombs, and creating an absolute firestorm. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, they broke off and vanished back into the welcoming darkness of the desert, leaving behind 37 destroyed or damaged aircraft and a scene of utter devastation. The ghosts had struck again. The ghost raids did not cease after Sidi Haneish. They intensified, becoming a relentless campaign of sabotage that systematically choked Rommel's air power. The Afrika Korps, once an unstoppable force, began to falter as its vital supply lines from the air were severed. The Luftwaffe could no longer provide effective support for ground operations, bombers were destroyed on the ground, and transport planes carrying essential fuel and ammunition were turned to ash. By September 1942, the SAS had destroyed 127 aircraft. By December, the tally exceeded 200. The impact on the North African campaign was profound and tangible. When General Montgomery launched the decisive Second Battle of El Alamein in November, he did so against an enemy already crippled from within. Rommel, the Desert Fox, was forced into a prolonged retreat, his forces starved of the supplies that had once flowed so freely from the skies. A captured German diary from the period contained a telling entry. "We fear the night raids more than the British tanks. you cannot fight ghosts. But this unprecedented success came at a terrible and predictable price. On October 18th, 1942, Hitler's commando order was formally issued, explicitly mandating the execution of all captured enemy commandos to the last man. The SAS, with their tactics of infiltration and their use of enemy uniforms, were prime targets. 34 of their men, when captured, were not treated as prisoners of war. They were executed as war criminals, their deaths a brutal confirmation of the risks they had always known they were taking. The unit fought on, understanding that capture meant a firing squad with no trial, their sacrifice buried in classified files marked deniable. By the war's end in 1945, the SAS had destroyed over 400 enemy aircraft, a tally greater than that of any Allied fighter squadron. They had fundamentally altered the course of the Desert War, but when peace came, the unit was officially disbanded. The very methods that had made them so effective were too irregular, too uncomfortable for a peacetime army. The men returned to civilian life, their heroism often unheralded. David Stirling returned to Scotland, a quiet private man who largely refused interviews and declined lucrative book deals. When pressed on the morality of their methods, his answer was always the same. We did what was necessary. Paddy Mayne, the legendary warrior who had personally destroyed more aircraft than any ace pilot, was recommended for the Victoria Cross on 4 separate occasions. Each time, the recommendation was denied. The official reason was never stated, but the shadow of the Geneva Convention and their unorthodox, technically illegal tactics hung heavy over the decision. Mayne returned to Northern Ireland and his work as a solicitor, a man of immense violence and quiet contemplation who never spoke of the war. He died in a car accident on December 14th, 1955, exactly 14 years after his first devastating raid at Wadi Tamet. The legacy of these men, however, could not be so easily dismissed. The doctrine they pioneered, small, highly trained teams operating deep behind enemy lines, using asymmetry and shock to defeat a numerically superior foe, became the bedrock of modern special forces. The British SAS was revived in 1952. The American Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, and countless other elite units around the world, all trace their tactical DNA back to the deserts of North Africa and Stirling's revolutionary insight. The rules of war were eventually updated in the 1949 Geneva Conventions, a tacit acknowledgement of the complex realities of 20th century conflict. The new conventions prohibited wearing enemy uniforms, but included a crucial nuance. It was not a grave breach if combatants identified themselves before attacking. It was a compromise forged in the fires of the very war the SAS had fought. The lesson of the SAS is not that rules do not matter. It is that in the face of existential threats, when the survival of nations hangs in the balance, the choice is often between bad options and worse ones. These men chose to break a rule to save countless lives. They accepted the label of criminal to become saviors. Their story lives on, not just in the memorials that bear their names, but in the very concept of modern special warfare. They dared, and in doing so, they taught the world how to win. If this story of courage and impossible choices resonated with you, please honor their memory by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing for more tales of history's defining moments. We would be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below.